Who was Jesus for real?
I think he was a mystic. I think he was well educated. I think he knew about the mystery religions of the time period. I think he was also devoutly Jewish. And I think at that time, Judaism, well, it wasn't Judaism, what we would say today. That's Rabbinic Judaism comes after 70 AD. So when Jesus was around, it was a whole different type of religious atmosphere going on in that period. And there was a lot of magician stuff going on. Mm-hmm. A lot of, like, you know, Simon Magus. The title Magus, those are like people who perform miracles. And Jesus was one of those characters. So Jesus was, you know, the title Magus or Magi. These were people around. And by the way, the Magi are the ones finding the baby Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the early Christians in the sources had that title. Like Marcus Magus was an early Christian.
Right.
Simon Magus was an early Christian. These Magi or Magus characters were in the business of performing miracles and doing mystery rites, initiations, baptisms, Eucharist, magic, mystic ceremonies, basically. And Jesus was one of these characters, performing these magic rites.
So was he just doing drugs?
Drugs are involved. Psychedelics are involved. And look, let's go to the sources, right? Epiphanius talks about an early Christian sect that he says descended from the Nicolaitans. Nicolaitans are mentioned in Revelation, so we're talking 1st century. Mm-hmm. And they split off into a bunch of different groups. There's the Borborites, the Zacchaeans, the Fibionites, the Socratites, Codians, Barbellites, Secundians. There's more. I just wanted to give a whole handful of lists. There's a whole bunch of them.
Right. And
these are all branching off of this Nicolaitan sect. According to Epiphanius, this is what he says. I'm just repeating what the sources say. Mm-hmm. It's not like a theory that I have. This is just what the sources say. And they had their own text. It was a Gospel of Mary. Mm-hmm. Now, people might say, I've read the Gospel of Mary. It's not this one. There's a different Gospel of Mary. It's called like the Questions Concerning Mary or something. That's how Epiphanius refers to it. But they call it a gospel, and even Epiphanius says they call it a gospel. And it's a different gospel, very different gospel. And in this text, the Yaldabaoth is there. He's the god he's the Hebrew god, right? Uh-huh. Jesus is the son of a different god called Barbello. And Barbello is associated with Sophia. They call it the mother father. It's like a figure. It's like this very fascinating deity that is like the creator of all things, wisdom incarnate, descending from the highest ions of the monad, right? Mm-hmm. This is what they say in the text. But there's an 8th heaven, and Jesus and Barbello they rule that heaven. We're below it. We're in the 7th heaven, where heaven and earth is. And Yaldabaoth rules this. I'm just laying out what their ideas are. But what they did, according to this gospel, Jesus takes Mary up on a mountain, has sex with her.
Mary Magdalene.
Who, by the way, Mark says the one if you put it next to Mark, we just read it. Mark says, Mary Magdalene, the one whom Jesus took 7 demons out of.
Mark said that.
Mark's gospel says.
Oh, yeah, we just read that.
Yeah, Mary Magdalene, the one who he exorcised 7 demons out of. Like, what does that mean? But this is what these Borborites said, that Jesus took her on, this is in the sources.
Right.
Jesus took her on a mountain. This is in their gospel. So it's not just like a rumor. This was written in a gospel. Jesus took Mary onto a mountain, had sex with her, told her to make it to the kingdom of heaven, he has to eat his flesh. She has to eat his flesh and drink his blood. And he made her a Eucharist with his semen, his load.
Yes.
What the
God, dude?
And that's what it says. And by the way,
so who? Mark wrote that?
We don't know who wrote this.
We don't know who wrote this.
We have no idea. It's a lost gospel, but it's cited in the sources. It existed all the way up until the 3rd century, and then we start losing. And it's not mentioned anymore.
It existed all up to the third century, and this was found on a papyrus scroll.
No. This is just cited by people in the 3rd century. Epiphanius.
Oh, it's cited.
Yeah,
okay.
Epiphanius is one of these early saints in the church. He's talking about this in his text called the Panarion.
Okay.
And then he continues. He says, that's in their gospel. But then we know, he says, they perform the craziest rituals where they take psychedelics, they speak in tongues, they prophesy the future, and they eat aborted babies.
So this was
This is gonna sound like I'm making this up.
It's so crazy.
But you could, if someone's watching, say, what is he talking about? Just look it up. Panarion by Epiphanius against the Borborites. Or actually, look up Borborites on Wikipedia. Wikipedia even says this.
Borborites on Wikipedia.
B O R B O R B O R B O R ITES.
Right.
It's in the Wikipedia page.
So
this is like well-known scholarship.
All the people that were writing back then, how do we it's hard to determine like who was like what their motives were behind what they were writing, or if they had an axe to grind against somebody or an idea or a religion, or if it was just like an ancient tabloid, right? Like the National Enquirer of antiquity. and so how do you, like, even if this exists among all these other pieces of writing, like how do we know to take that for real, or if that an ancient writer could have been full of shit?
That's a good question. And that's you're thinking like a scholar right now, because a lot of like Bart Ehrman is one of the people who think that Epiphanius is slandering them. He thinks none of this happened, that Epiphanius wants people to not like them. So he's making up like, oh, they eat babies.
Right, right.
Which could be true.
Right.
Or there could be something in the middle.
Well, that's what
it
we
could
say.
be somewhat
Yeah.
true. Maybe they are doing Eucharist with some stuff, psychedelics or whatever. Maybe they're doing, maybe not eating aborted babies. That sounds like crazy.
That's like what we say about Hillary Clinton today.
Right. People are slandering people, and sometimes the truth is halfway in the middle. Mm-hmm. That's how I would approach it. I would take it with a grain of salt, because Epiphanius does not like these people. You got to remember that he's writing about people he does not like. So you got to take it with a grain of salt. Right. But then you got to think, like, if he was wrong, somebody might have wrote and said, "Hey, Epiphanius is wrong about this. We don't have anything like that." Nobody can test that what he's saying.
Okay.
So that's another thing you got to think about. So it could be somewhere in the middle.
Right.
That's what I would say.
Now, Mary Magdalene, what is their contention? Because Amen also said something about her being a prostitute.
Yeah.
Or
it's pretty obvious.
And then some people think that they were married, right?
There are people who think that they're I mean, it's
what is the contention there, and what
it's just the way Mary is presented in all of the Gospels, not just the ones we have, not just the 4 main Gospels, but the extra additional apocryphal Gospels. There's another Gospel of Mary too, where Mary is the one who gets all the secret wisdom that none of the other apostles have. She's the highest of all of them, and that's called the Gospel of Mary. That's the one that we have that was found in the Nag Hammadi scrolls in Egypt. But the way she's presented is like she's just always around him. She's always with Jesus. She's got other girls that are like following her, so she has her own entourage, and then she's following Jesus with his entourage. It looks like they're together, and they're like both operating some sort of mission. Whatever it is.
Like they're both pimps?
Whatever. This is what the mystery religions were like in the 1st century.
Right.
And especially if we look at the Dionysian religions. And by the way, someone might say, the Dionysian and the Christians are opposites. Actually, John Kloppenborg, mainstream scholar, one of the great academics of our time, wrote a whole book called Christ Associations. And he points out in that book that the way early Christian churches operated, they're called ecclesias. They were almost following the playbook of the Dionysian ecclesias. They were doing everything the same. So they're both groups are doing like, they bury their dead in the same catacombs together. They do specific rites at dinner parties. The way they bring out stuff, the way like he's basically saying like the evidence shows that the Dionysian groups and the Christian groups were operating in the same way, just worshiping different gods. Obviously, they're worshiping Christ here. They're worshiping Dionysus. So the devotees of Dionysus were similar in the way they handled themselves and carried themselves to the way the Christians were. Wow. So this is not like crazy to think that the mystery religions of the 1st century could have looked a lot like what these early Christians, what Jesus and Mary were doing.
Yeah.
Just in Judea. just through the Jewish worldview in their tongue, in their Syriac, whatever language Syriac was probably the language they were speaking in, which is like an Aramaic, Hebrew.
Is that what Jesus spoke?
Probably Syriac.
Syriac?
Yeah. It's a form of Aramaic that was popular in Nazareth. It was like the native tongue of the Nazarenes. So that's probably what Jesus spoke in.
I think Amon said he spoke Greek. Amon's just like diehard.
He just loves Greek.
He's just a Greek.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. Amon's going to say, well, show me a text where Jesus is speaking in Syriac. And okay, you're right. We don't have that. We're just basically guessing on what was the language of Nazareth. It was Syriac. And there was Greek everywhere, though. So he probably knew some. Everyone knew Greek. It was the language. That's like English today. Mm-hmm. If you can be here in Florida, there's places where Spanish is big, right? Yep. But everyone knows a little English.
Yes.
So he had to have known Greek to some extent because that was the lingua franca of that period in the Eastern Roman Empire.
Right.
So yeah, Amon's not wrong. He did speak Greek. Yeah, it's at least some of it. At least he had to have.
What is the biggest, most blatant misconception of Christianity, or modern
that people don't know? Like
yes.
So a lot. Okay, this is a big one. The manuscript traditions. So a lot of people don't know that Mark is the oldest gospel. People think it's Matthew because in the open of the Bible, Matthew's the first gospel. Then
right.
Mark is the oldest. A lot of people don't know most of the gospels are dated to, they'll say first century, but it's probably late first to the second century where the gospels start showing up in the sources. Mm-hmm. But this is a crazy thing. In Mark, which is the oldest gospel, mm-hmm. there's no mention of Joseph as Jesus' father. Before that, Paul was the oldest text. Paul never mentions Joseph. So the first time Joseph gets mentioned in any of the sources is in Matthew's gospel, which is like 85 to 95 AD. But even worse than that, the scene in Mark where Jesus returns from the dead and shows the disciples that he's risen, mm-hmm. that's not in the oldest manuscripts. In the oldest manuscripts, the ones that are dated to like the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, he doesn't come back. It literally ends tragically with the women weeping at the tomb. And the angels tell the women that he's risen, but they don't ever see him. He doesn't have to come back. Then when in the manuscript tradition, after the 5th century is when you start seeing an extra 21 verses get added to the Bible about Jesus coming back and saying, hey, look, I'm risen.
No way.
And it probably has to do with Celsus and Porphyry, these early, they call them pagan. They're not really pagans. They're like Platonist mm-hmm. writers who are very critical of Christianity. One of the things Celsus says, this is a book from the 2nd century against the Christians, where he even says, how do you even know he rose? All you're going off is just 2 women that said they met an angel? What? And you think this is the Son of God? I'm not believing this. So, and we know that this was a big deal to the Christians because Irenaeus, about a couple decades later, had to write a whole book addressing Celsus. It was called Against Celsus. Mm. So he was like, Celsus was like going after these Christians, and he was whooping their asses. I've bleeped that part out.
Wow.
But like philosophical, like debating wise, he was beating them up pretty bad.
Right.
Which makes me think that's why they added those 21 verses and said, wait a minute. No, he did come back, and here's what actually happened. But if you can fact check me, whoever's watching this, mm-hmm. The last chapter of Mark, the last 21 verses in that last chapter do not show up in any of the manuscripts before the 5th century.
The last part of, but did you say Mark was the first one to write about it?
Mark's the first gospel.
Mark's the first gospel. And none of the manuscripts before that.
Yes.
Can you say that again?
Okay, so Mark being the first gospel,
right,
we have manuscripts of Mark, right. So the first actual Bible, church Bible, where it has the Old Testament plus the New Testament, is in the 4th century in 325 AD.
Okay.
Before that, it was all individual manuscripts. So you have Mark floating around by itself, Matthew floating around by itself.
Okay, got it.
And some people would put together their own little, like a guy named Marcion put together a New Testament where it was 7 epistles of Paul plus Luke. Mm-hmm. And maybe Acts, I think, but I can't remember. But Mark, the Gospel of Mark that was in circulation before the 5th century only had those up till the last 21 verses. So if that's Mark right there, if you go to the last chapter,
we just lost Neal's audio, or I did at least.
Yeah,
I meant to unmute my mic. I was on his.
Okay.
Oh, okay. We'll just cut that part out.
This one goes all the way down to the 16. Does it go any further than that?
Yeah. Okay. So
All right.
if you go down, this is Mark 16.
Yeah.
So if you go all the way down to the bottom, where it says, keep going. All right, go up. So afterward, he appeared to the 11 themselves.
Yeah.
As they were reclining at the table, and he rebuked them. That's not in the oldest manuscripts. That's added. All of that stuff. And this is consensus. Any Bible scholar will agree with me on this. This is not some wild.
Is there a way to access online the original?
Yes, there are.
How can we see find the original?
Bart Ehrman is a textual critic. Dr. Bart Ehrman. This is
Bart
what
Ehrman.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he has like the different manuscript traditions and the translations of them, what they say, what the variations are. And you could just like look up, like he'll point out that those last, so the last verse is 19 or 20 actually. It's all the way up until when you start seeing Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. That's the last verse of the oldest manuscripts.
And now
look, it says it right there. Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 9 through 20.
No way.
I'm sorry. I said 21 verses. I'm sorry. It's 11 verses. My bad.
11. Okay.
Yeah, those last 11 verses.
They don't include 16, 9 through 20.
And this is Bible.com that's saying that. This is not a crazy. This is not like some word.
So they don't include this one right here.
Yeah,
now when
all
he
of that.
rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out
7 demons.
7 demons.
That's all added.
That's added.
And because people are criticizing and saying, wait a minute, how do you know this is even true if all you're going off is they went to his tomb and he wasn't there? Because that's how it ends. They go to his tomb, he's not there. Now, to be fair, in the Augustan period or the Flavian period, which is the 1st century,
right,
there was an ancient trope where if this is a big trope where a hero would die, like Hercules or something, and they would go to his tomb and his body was gone, and it meant that he rose to heaven. It was an ancient trope. So that whoever wrote Mark was basically saying this happened to Jesus too. So that is a common thing. If the bodies disappeared, it means that angels rose him up to heaven. But if you're being critical, you would say, how do you know someone didn't steal the body? So they end up adding verses.
Right.
That's the earliest gospel. That's what it is.
That's wild,
Yeah.
man.
How old can we date the Masoretic Hebrew the Old Testament? When does it start showing up in the sources? People think that the people think that Moses wrote the Torah in the Bronze Age. Some people say like 1300 BC. Moses started writing the Torah, and it's been passed down since then. And then, new books are added or whatever. That's nonsense. Nonsense. In fact, when Israel got conquered by the Assyrians, by Nebuchadnezzar, in 597 BCE, most of the Jews were brought to Babylon. Everyone knows this story. It's famous. The fall of the first temple, right? But what we found out later is that a lot of Jews went back into Egypt. And it was like an exodus backwards. And they settled in this city called Elephantine. So Elephantine is a city of an ancient Jewish city in Egypt that dates, we have texts from that period from archaeology. We dug up papyri, thousands of papyri. So we know what they believed in. We know what their ideas were. There is no Moses. There is no Noah. There's no David. There's no mention of Abraham. Nothing. And they're worshiping multiple gods. So wait a minute. If the Torah already existed before Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BCE, wouldn't these Jews in Elephantine have Moses and Abraham and and Noah in these texts, they have zero. We have thousands of texts from this place. No, not one mention of Abraham. Not one mention of Moses. How does that make sense?
Where did it come from then?
Well, like Amon points out, like I've been pointing out, like Russell Gmerkin been pointing out, these texts are written way later.
Yeah.
And they're just backdating themselves, which is common. This happens all the time. It happens in Greek sources, the Sibylline oracles. They backdate themselves. They'll say, this is a text from 10,000 years ago. Like, this happens all the time. This is not some random thing. That's Elephantine. That's where they're settled. And they dug up thousands of papyri and inscriptions. And they have Yahweh. They call him Yahoo. It's a different spelling of the way Yahweh. But he's there. So it is the Jews. And they're writing in Aramaic.
And sorry, remind me again what year this is?
They fled Israel in 597 BC.
597 BC.
So between 597 and 410, that's a long time. It's 200 years, right?
Yeah.
We have texts that are dating between 597 and 410 from that city, dating texts from that period.
Papyri
and
scrolls?
None of them mention Abraham, Moses, or Noah.
And when were Moses and Noah supposed to have lived?
Way before that.
Way before that.
Like
we're talking like
Noah's
3,000?
2,000 years before that.
2,000 years before that.
Moses would be almost 1,000 years, 800 years before that.
And when did the very first writings of Noah and these guys?
Okay, this is a great question. We can't say when's the first time it was ever written down, but we can say if there's anybody who ever mentions Moses, who's the first one to do it outside of the text that's claiming, that you can't date the text with the text, right?
Right.
You got to use an outside text. Who cites this text? Who's mentioning this text? You want to know the first time it's ever mentioned?
When?
Hecataeus of Abdera in around 320 BC. First time Moses is ever mentioned. He writes a text about Abraham. He writes a text about Moses and Noah. It's Hecataeus of Abdera. That's his name. A guy named Berosus. A guy named Manetho. These guys start. So they're all contemporaries with each other. Late 4th century BC, early 3rd century BC, you start hearing about Moses, Abraham, and Noah.
Wow.
Before that, nobody mentions them.
What the dude?
And for some reason, in Bible scholarship land, they don't talk about this. They know this is true. They won't deny it. They can't argue against it. But they'll say, there's probably an oral tradition, man. Calm down. And I'll say, well, what about Elephantine? There are all these texts there from 200-year period.
Right.
And there was probably a fringe sect. That's what they'll say.
When was the Dead Sea Scrolls conventionally? What is the conventional idea when they were written? When they were
First century BC.
First century BC.
Yeah, so that's way later. You can't use that, yeah.
But those are all in Hebrew?
No, there's Greek ones.
There's some in Greek, too.
There's some Greek, yeah.
And I believe Ammon was claiming that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from Greek.
Yeah, so there's some, I can't really talk too much about this. I don't know too much, but I've heard for that. It looks like the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them were translating from the Greek side. So the ones that we found, and I'm not going to die on this hill. I could be wrong.
Right.
But there are people who say that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls looks like it's coming from the Greek tradition. So, and by the way, in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because in the Greek Septuagint, Yah-O, which is the Greek way to spell Yahweh, there is no Yah-O in the Septuagint, but in the Greek manuscripts from Dead Sea Scrolls, the Yah-O is in there. And people.
When did the Septuagint come about?
Well, the oldest ones we have is from 325 AD.
325.
So anything could have changed between 300. Well, they say it's like 270 BC when the Septuagint got produced or translated or whatever.
Right.
And I'm fine with if the academics are if the experts are saying it's a translation, I don't care. Fine. All I'm saying is there's no. It could be. It's fine. It's a translation all day. I don't care. All I care about is when was it written, and to me, there's no evidence that any of the Hebrew or the Greek shows up before the 4th century BC.
Wow.
And that word Yah-O in Greek shows up in the oldest manuscripts from the Dead Sea region, but in the Church Bible, the Old Testament in Greek, the Septuagint, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, and the Codex Alexandricus. Those 3 church Bibles have they changed the name Yahweh to Kurios, which means Lord in Greek. So the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. That's why the Bible always says the Lord instead of Yahweh. But in the oldest manuscripts, Yahweh is present. We have a Deuteronomy manuscript from Dead Sea, and it says, it's got the 3 letters, iota, alpha, omega, Yahweh. And by the way, I think I know why they changed it, because the Yahweh is actually an old name for Dionysus.
Really?
Yes. Dionysus has the same name as Yahweh. And get this, Plutarch, who wrote in the 2nd century, says that he has a whole text called which god is worshipped by the Jews? And he says it's Dionysus.
Dionysus.
He said it's some Eastern form of Dionysus, because Dionysus wasn't just a wine god. That's like an attribute attributed to him. And then when the Romans adopt Dionysus, the Roman version of Dionysus, he becomes this wine party god. But if you go back, the oldest forms of Dionysus you could find, he's way more than that. He's a god of life. He's a god of the growing of the crops. He's a god of Bacchic. It's called Bacchic mania, but it's like divine inspiration.
Wasn't he the son of Zeus?
He's the son of Zeus. He's the heir of heaven.
Right.
He was born from the marriage between Persephone, who's the queen of the underworld, and Zeus.
Right.
And in that text, he's the heir to. He's no other son of God, not Hercules, not Apollo. Only Dionysus is called the heir to heaven. That's it. Only one time. It's only Dionysus.
And he was Yahweh.
According to Plutarch, because they both have, in the oldest text of Dionysus, like there are sources of the Chaldean oracles is one. His name is Yahweh in Greek, which is the same way you spell Yahweh in Greek. They have the same exact name. This is where it gets crazy. When is Easter?
March?
In March, April, springtime.
Right.
It depends on what's called the first full moon after the spring equinox. So it could happen in March, it could happen in April. Depends on whenever the first full moon happens after the spring equinox, which is March 22nd, I think.
Okay.
So after March 22nd, whenever the first full moon hits, it's the next Sunday. That's it. So you're already like, sounds like some pagan shit. They're basing it off the stars and the moon and stuff.
Yeah.
But we find out that in the ancient world, before Christianity was even existed, there was three big festivals actually. One of them is called the Adonia. The other one's called the Hilaria. And then there's another Hilaria for Osiris. So down in Egypt, they celebrate the Hilaria. It's always in March, April. Same with the one in Rome for Attis, always in March, April. And then the Adonia is always in March, April. And they're all of them are celebrating the death of a god, either Adonis, Attis, or Osiris. They're always weeping over a god and then rejoicing over his resurrection. And this one in particular, passed down to us from a guy named Arnobius of Sicca. He says that the Hilaria festival was a week long. It starts on March 15th, and it ends on March 20. It ends on the March. I think either March 15th or 22nd. Anyway, it's right at the spring equinox, right where Easter is. Same week as Easter. I think it ends on March 30th or something. And he says there's a day of burial where they take a pine tree that represents the god. They bury it. This is all before the 1st century. This is all 1st century BC, before Christianity.
Okay.
They take a pine tree and they bury it in the dirt, and then they mourn for 2 days. On the 3rd day, it's called the Day of Rejoicing. There's a day of blood, and that's the day where they castrate themselves, and the initiates would become priests of the Great Mother. So Attis dies from castration. The new priest, every year during this Easter festival, basically, it's called the Hilaria. It was called the Day of Blood. It was the day after the day of burial, where they would weep. They would get a new initiates. They would castrate themselves, and they become priests. They would wear women's clothing and everything. And on the 3rd day, it's called the Hilaria. Hilaria means rejoice in Latin. The 3rd day is the day of rejoicing, and they would rejoice of the resurrection of Attis. This happens at the same week as Easter.
Oh my God, dude!
So the
Easter tradition comes way before Christianity.
Way before. way before. Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Dionysus, they all have their own resurrection festivals. And they're always there, and three out of four of
And you
those
said
are
they would
at
bury
the
a-
same week as Easter.
Right. And they would bury a pine tree?
They'd bury a pine tree. Or no,
Pine cone.
pine tree. Yeah, pine tree.
A pine tree.
Pine tree. Yes.
And that was supposed to represent a sort of god
Dead
or something?
god Attis.
The dead god Attis.
It's called the Hilaria Festival. Look it up. It's even on Wikipedia.
Can you look that up, the
yeah.
Hilaria
Yeah.
Festival?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
this is all known stuff. By the way, Christian scholars fight this. They'll say it's a coincidence. You'll say, you say there's no way this doesn't influence Christianity. They say it doesn't. They fight
They're
this.
saying no, there's no way this influences Christianity.
That's what they say.
Click on the Hilaria
Hilaria.
link.
Yeah, I'm telling you, it's all
Go
in
to the
there.
link. There you go. Hilaria.
So if you want to read that for a second.
The
but if you-
Hilaria, Latin for the cheerful one, a term derived from the borrowed adjective, ancient Greek, or the borrowed adjective,
March equinox. See? That's the great mother, Kybele.
the March equinox to honor Kybele.
Now, if you go down, to, it's going to say like the days. If you keep going, I'll tell you when to stop.
Festival structure.
Oh yeah, this might be. Here it
There
is.
you go.
Look. March
Okay.
15th. Read. This is the whole schedule.
The first festival can be tentatively reconstructed with the days of the festival literally translated as follows. 15th of March, the reed entered. Its exact significance is uncertain. The reeds may refer to the riverbanks where Attis was exposed as a child and rescued by Cybele. The 9-day period of abstinence from bread.
like they do,
Pomegranates.
like how they do right before Easter is Lent. It's like Lent. Right.
Only milk was permitted to drink.
Yeah.
22nd of March, the tree entered. A pine tree is felled.
Told
A
you.
tree is set up at the temple of Cybele. The trunk is wrapped in wool and its branches decked with wreaths and violets.
It's like a Christmas tree.
Right. Oh, whoa.
Look, it's like a Christmas tree. Now keep going.
A pine tree is felled. The tree is set up at the temple of Cybele. The trunk is wrapped in wool and its branches decked in wreaths and violets.
Yeah, and they would put little toy Attises on top of it like an angel. This is what they said in the sources. Look,
What?
the next day they mourn. This is exactly what I just said. Just repeat. Look at. Then after the day of mourning is called the Day of Blood. Castration rituals would take place. Told you.
The tree is symbolically buried.
Buried for his death, and then look at the third day. Count from the day of mourning to the day of joy.
Yep, the 22nd to the 25th, 3 days.
That's 3 days later. Just like Jesus is dead on the third day he rises.
my God.
Look, the
dude.
day of joy on March 25th, the resurrection of Attis. Now you're going to sit there and tell me this didn't influence Christianity? Get the out of here. You are full. These Christian scholars in the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, full of shit. They know this and don't care. They all Bart Ehrman and Dan McClellan. They all know this and don't care.
Does it say anywhere on this page what part in history in the human time or the timeline of history where this started?
200 BC.
Where does it say that here?
Well, that's when they imported the god to Rome. And by the way, yeah, if you read the source that actually has the calendar, the guy who wrote that was living probably in this. I don't remember when exactly, but yeah, this was a festival that started.
The writing in the 4th century.
Yeah, that's
AD.
when he's writing this though. He's a Christian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Described the basic multi-day structure of the festivals as it relates to the myth of Cybele and Attis.
Yeah, that's when the Christians are writing about this.
Right.
That's when the Christians are writing about it. Okay.
If you look, when the importation of the cult of Cybele happens in 204 BCE.
click on Cybele.
Yeah, click on Cybele.
Where?
That's a good.
Down,
That's where you're gonna find
very
it.
bottom.
Oh,
Yeah,
I see.
right there.
Yes. Okay. Sibley.
God, this is a lot of work to figure out the
Yeah,
truth,
yeah.
man.
It is. No, you're asking good questions. Look right there. 205 BCE. Keep going down.
Oh yeah, the very bottom. Okay, in
Look.
Rome, Cybele became known as the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, a Roman state adopted and developed in a particular form of her cult after the Sibylline Oracle in 205 BC.
That's when they started doing this thing.
Recommended her conscription as a key religious ally in Rome's second war against Carthage, 218 to 201 BC. So,
That's when they imported her cult.
in 205 BC.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. And then they were writing about it at 300 AD.
Yeah, but that Christian source is the source that we have to go off.
Right.
That's how we preserved it.
Happened.
We have to go through the Christians for almost everything.
And they kept repurposing this ritual.
Sure.
Throughout time, like from there up until Christianity.
That's when it becomes a Roman religion in 204 BC, 205. I thought it was 204.
Wow, dude.
But that's when they start doing that. That's when the rituals all start.
Can you find any sort of picture or illustration of that ritual, like on images? Like
if you type
in
Addis tree, you'll see someone from that time period drew something on this. Look on there, right there. Yeah. But
there's a little lion underneath it.
This was a Phrygian religion before a Roman religion.
And they're hanging things from this pine tree.
See? It looks like a little Christmas tree. By the way, the Phrygians go back to they're from Anatolia. That's an ancient rite that goes back to the Hittites. They worship the Great Mother in the Hittite period, Bronze Age. So that's I don't know how when Addis comes in, I would say probably sometime in the Iron Age, but in the Bronze Age before that, Cybele or Kubaba, they called it back then. That's how old it is. She was worshipped by the Hittites. Kubaba.
What is the connection between, or the misconceptions between, the Nephilim and the Anunnaki?
So the Anunnaki come from the Sumerian and Babylonian texts.
Those texts came from when?
Like 3000 BC.
3000 BC.
Yeah, like this is the oldest text that exists in the world. Like there's nothing older than Sumerian text. I mean, there's stories that predate these texts, but they're not written down. This is Sumer is the first place where we get written text. And they're in cuneiform and Akkadian, and they write about these Anunnaki. And there's this group of gods that, and sometimes they're in the underworld, and some stories they're in the heavens. Depends on what story you're looking at. Most of the time, it's the underworld gods, which is a misconception. People think that these are coming from above, but most of the texts describe them as in the underworld. But there are some texts that do describe them coming from the heavens, so that there is some credibility there. But they get lumped in with the Nephilim because the Nephilim are also described as these.
Oh, these are the tablets.
Those are the old ancient Sumerian tablets. Yeah.
Wow.
They're from like 3000, 2000 BC, somewhere in between, 2500 BC. Yeah, super old. Now check this out, right? So the Nephilim are these like fallen gods. Sometimes they're called giants because Nephil can mean giant in Greek, but Nephil also can mean to fall. So depending on how you read it, it could be fallen ones or giants. And there's two different translations for that. In some texts, they're the fallen ones. In some texts, they're the giants. Or maybe they're both. Maybe that's a pun. You never know. But they get lumped in with the Anunnaki because the story is very similar as the Anunnaki, in the sense that there are stories of Anunnaki being cast out from the presence of Enlil. And they end up serving other purposes, and that's how they get. So there's a very similar story happening between the two, which I think there's some credibility to that. But this is where it gets crazy.
How the hell do you translate that?
I don't know. They can read that though. People can read that.
Looks like chicken scratch.
Yeah, it does. Samuel Noah Kramer translated all these texts that I'm about to describe, and one of the texts that mentions the Anunnaki, there's a guy named what's his name? Utnapishtim. And there's a couple different flood stories. One of them is called Artahasis. That's another guy. And the other one's called the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes.
And this guy, so depending on which story you're getting at, the guy whoever's in the flood story, he survives a flood that's...
Gilgamesh, I think it is.
Well, Gilgamesh, that's the name of the story, but the guy's name is Artahasis, who survives the flood.
Okay.
And he survives this flood, and at the end of the story, he lets off a dove and a raven and waits for 7 days for them to come back. This is exactly what Genesis says for Noah. When Noah is at the end of the flood after 40 days, he lets off a dove and a raven and waits 7 days for them to return. It's exactly the same. They're literally borrowing from this story. So the story of Noah surviving the ark is actually predated by thousands of years in this Sumerian story. So there's two ways of looking at it. You can be critical and say, yeah, this is an ancient story, an ancient pagan story being repurposed by the Jews. Or you could say, this is actually so ancient and so true that it shows up in this other story in the ancient world. Depending on which way how you want to spin it, right?
Right.
You can make it positive for the Noah's Ark. Say Noah's Ark is so true that we find it in another version in a different story. Or you can say it's such a retelling of an ancient pagan story that it can't be true because this is already in a text from 1,000 years before Noah was ever talked about.
Right.
Because there's no mention of Noah until classical period, Hellenistic period, basically Persian period. If you want to be like, give him a little bit of maybe Persian period, but there's no mention of Noah before that.
So the story goes that the Anunnaki, the Enlil and Enki, created these Ajijis who were supposed to terraform the earth, and they got tired of working or whatever, and then they created human beings somehow.
Yep.
Or they like sacrificed a god to create humans to be the slaves to do all this hard work.
Yeah, and Enki, and this is where I get into. This is like Enki is this god in the ancient Sumerian stories, who he creates humans, but he's also like a trickster. And he seems to always defy the will of Enlil. So he's almost like a proto-Satan character, where he cares about humans, but when Enlil wants to flood everybody, he wants to kill humans, Enlil, because he's sick of them. He wants to flood them out. They're all sinners. They're all dumbasses. But Enki saves them. Enki's the one that tells Arthur-Hasis to build the ark, because Enlil's going to kill you guys. He gives them. He wasn't supposed to do that. He defies the will of Enlil. This also happens in the Greek mythology. When Zeus is fed up with humans, he wants to send a flood.
Right.
It's Prometheus who says, "Hey, Zeus is going to kill you all." Prometheus is the creator god, and he's a trickster. So Prometheus is the Greek version of Enki. And you can almost say in Judeo-Christianity, it's Satan that's that character.
And Prometheus tried to, I don't know where I'm pulling this information from, but I feel like I read this somewhere, but Prometheus
Probably
tried
from
to
me and Giorgiani's talk.
He tried to trick Zeus.
When me and Giorgiani had our talk about Prometheus, we talked about this in depth.
Okay.
We went, that's probably where you saw it when I was telling you about Giorgiani. Giorgiani's really into this whole idea of Prometheus is actually Lucifer, but he's not the evil one. It's very Gnostic, and it's a very Gnostic idea in the sense that the good God is actually the bad one, and the bad one is actually the good one.
Right.
And he's trying to give you the knowledge to save yourself.
And Prometheus wanted to save humanity from Zeus.
And
he tried to like trick Zeus by
he just went against his back.
There was like some sort of like animal that they were having a feast or whatever.
That's another one.
And he tried to trick him by giving him two pieces, and one of them was like looked like a bunch of meat, but it was filled with bones. And he thought Zeus would pick the wrong one.
Yes, the idea of Prometheus is to teach people that the gods can be manipulated and tricked in the right circumstances if you're slick enough to do it. It's almost like Prometheus represents the tree of knowledge. Take a bite. See what happens.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That's and then he like sentenced him to like die a new death every day on a mountain.
He sends him up to the Caucasus Mountains, where he's from, and he chains him up. I wish I had this one book that I have written by Kyle Karenny about Prometheus, where he finds the oldest depictions of Prometheus from Etruscan art, from Greek art, and he's always depicted with his arms up like this, chained to a rock, like a crucifixion.
Maybe you could find that photo, or that image.
I think Christianity is drawing from these motifs and then repurposing for different. Look at that. That's how the oldest. Look at his beard and everything. It looks like so Christ-like. You know what I mean?
Wow.
That's Prometheus.
Wow. And that's drawn
that's the Etruscan
500 BC.
That's the Etruscan spelling of his name.
BC.
Yeah. If you go down, it says it right there.
There's
another one. That's Prometheus. That's him being saved by Apollo and Hercules.
Oh wow!
Being taken off the cross, or being taken off of his. See, there's the eagle that's biting at his leg.
Yep.
Oh, check this out too. Talking about drugs, right? Medea.
Yeah.
The ancient witch Medea.
Yes. This is what Amun has tattooed on his head, right?
Yeah. She had a magic potion called Promethea, and it was the blood. Remember, we're talking about the blood of Christ being magic, and they're drinking in these Eucharists. This was happening for Prometheus back in the ancient world. Well, Prometheus' blood was mixed in a potion by Medea. The same blood that dripped from him while he was on the rock was made into a potion that can heal you and make you immortal.
No way.
Yeah. There's sources for this and everything. I could read the source if you want. You want to hear it? You want to hear it?
Christ. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. It's called The Magical Promethean Herb. It's from Apollonius of Rhodes, 3rd century BC. Anyone can look this up. It says, she, Medea, 3rd century BC, she, Medea, took a magic ointment from her box. This salve was named after Prometheus. A man had only to smear it on his body after propitiating the only begotten maiden, Hecate, with a midnight offering, to become invulnerable by sword or fire, and for that day to surpass himself in strength and daring. It first appeared in the plant that sprang from the blood-like ichor of Prometheus in his torment, which the flesh-eating eagle had dropped on the spurns of the Caucasus. The flowers, which grew on twin stalks a cubit high, were of the color Corsian, saffron, while the root, talking about root cutting, that's where you get DMT from roots, while the roots looked like flesh that had just been cut. By the way, root cutters is the name of an ancient sorcerer. They're called root cutters because they cut roots to make drugs with.
Right.
So these roots have just been cut, and the juice is like dark sap of a mountain oak. To make the ointment, Medea, clothed in black in the gloom of night, had drawn off his juice in a Caspian shell after bathing in 7 perennial streams and calling 7 times on Brimo, nurse of youth, Brimo, night wanderer of the underworld, queen of the dead. The dark earth shook and rumbled underneath the Titan root when it was cut, and Prometheus himself groaned in anguish of his soul. There it is right there. There's a bunch of sources on it. There's a bunch of sources on it too.
That's wild.
Yeah. You could see how look, it's not just that one source. There's a bunch of them. Mm-hmm. If you go, that's the one I just read. Uh-huh. If you go down, look, Perpertius, 1st century BC, he mentions it too. Valerius Flaccus, up a little bit, right there. Valerius Flaccus mentions it. Seneca. So that's 4 different sources that mention this magic blood ointment of Prometheus. It's called Promethea.
Wow. So Medea.
Yeah. Medea is the one who made it.
So what do you make of the connections of the Anunnaki to aliens by Zecharia Sitchin?
Zecharia Sitchin is famous for that.
A lot of people are running with this now.
They run with it,
saying that this. I've had people on this podcast.
Yeah, they love that idea. I mean, look, I can't read Sumerian, so I don't know how he got. he's apparently he can. Other scholars,
Sitchin.
Yeah, Sitchin can. Other scholars of Akkadian and say that his translations are sound. That's what they say. I'm just saying what they say. Mm-hmm. He might be right. I mean, that's something I want to look more into. It's a fascinating theory.
And Sitchin somehow...
You know me, I don't just side with scholars on anything. I look to see what the argument is. Right. I want to know, are you right? Does the data support it? I don't care what the consensus is. I look at the consensus because I want to compare it.
Right.
I'm always looking at what they're saying versus what the person's challenging them with. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Zecharia Sitchin, he says that the Anunnaki are fallen Nephilim, fallen aliens that... And these stories are written about him.
But there's a lot of contention between his translation of the word Nibiru, the planet he says they came from. Yeah. Which Nibiru was like some sort of planet that was like between Mars and Jupiter, and it somehow got hit and transformed into Earth, like something like that. But I guess like there's a different translation of Nibiru. Apparently that's not what it meant. It didn't mean some sort of other planet.
Yeah, it's like another realm or something, like another heaven realm or something like that.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying it is. And Sitchin doesn't think that. He thinks it's a planet. I don't know. I don't know what to say on that.
And he connected it to the pyramids somehow?
Yeah. I don't know how he got there. I have to look into what he said, to be honest. But I did talk to my friend Josh Bowen, who's a Syriologist. I asked him about this. We did a video on it. It's got 1.4 million views somehow. But he says that here's what this is where he thinks Zecharia Sitchin trips up. He says there's a lot of words in Akkadian that sound like it looks like 2 words together that sound like it might mean something else. For example, like we talked about this, how the word butterfly, we know what a butterfly is. It's a bug that flies around. But somebody in a different language 5,000 years from now might say, oh, it's butter that flies.
Right.
Butterfly.
A stick of butter that flies around.
So he thinks, so this is how he described it to me, my friend Josh. He said that Sitchin is doing this a lot. He sees words, and is so some of the stuff that he's translating might actually be there. But they're saying these words don't really mean that. They're used in different context.
Right.
So, yeah. But hey, look, I'm willing to give it a shake. I'll look into it more. You know, I haven't dug deep into Zecharia Sitchin and the alien thing yet.
Right.
There it is, butterfly boys and girls.
Especially with the latest stories coming out about these UFOs and stuff.
Yeah, the government's saying that they're angels now.
Right now might be the time to start looking into that stuff. You know?
They're angelic beings. They're not.
Who is saying that?
A lot of people in the government now are like saying that they are
like Mike Johnson and those guys.
Well, yeah, those people. Some of them like deep in the government, or like I don't know who exactly it is, but the consensus seems to be in like the UFO community that they're like looking for the next coming of Christ, and they're like angels flying around, or enlightened beings that are flying around.